All the Young Dudes, James's Perspective by Stay in Dreams. Chapter 4, First Year, The First Disappearance. James was sprawled across a scarlet sofa in the Gryffindor common room, his tongue poked out in concentration as his quill scratched against a roll of parchment. The ink-stained fingers were a small price to pay for finally being able to tell his parents that he was exactly where he belonged. Dear Mom and Dad, hello from Hogwarts. See, I'm writing to you, just like I promised. Classes start Monday, so we've got a few days to roam the castle and get settled in. The castle's brilliant, just like you described, especially Gryffindor Tower. Oh, and guess what? I made it into Gryffindor. It was practically vibrating with an electric surge of glee. Hogwarts wasn't just a school. It was an ancient playground that he'd been dreaming of since he was old enough to hold a toy broom. Back at Potter Manor, he'd always been under the doting but watchful eye of his mother. Now, the only person he had to answer to was a portrait of a fat lady and a few prefects he was fairly sure he could outrun. While he knew an oath from Euphemia would be winging its way to him the moment he did something truly extravagant, that felt like a problem for a much older version of himself. Present James was far more interested in testing the limits of his own new-found freedom. He could feel that streak of mischief humming in his blood, a trait he'd inherited from Fleemont. His dad was always the first to crack a joke or suggest a bit of fun, even if he did have a knack for stopping just before his mom's lips thinned into a line of disapproval. Here, however, James intended to find exactly where those lines were and then dance right over them. The best part, James decided as he glanced around the firelit room, was that he'd already found his pack. He spent the daylight hours sprinting through the corridors with Sirius, hunting down the secret passageways his dad had mentioned in his stories. They'd already sniffed out a few hidden tunnels behind tapestries, and although they hadn't quite mapped out the destinations yet, James was determined to know every inch of the castle by the end of the month. Evenings were just as brilliant. They'd huddled by the hearth, the air thick with the smell of wood and smoke and the chaos of exploding snap, or a cutthroat game of gobstones. And the talking. Merely, the talking was the best bit. James had never had a mate quite like Sirius Black. He'd always looked after Peter, but Peter's mind didn't quite move at the same speed as his. His banter was often a few seconds too slow to catch the punchline. Sirius, however, was like a lightning strike. He was sharp, cheeky, and just as mad about Quidditch as James was. When they were together, it felt like the rest of the world faded into the background, leaving only their inside jokes and shared ambitions. Of course, Peter was right there in the thick of it too. James wouldn't dream of leaving him behind. They'd been inseparable since they were toddlers, and to James, Peter was as much a part of his life as his own shadow. You didn't just ditch your shadow because you'd found a bright new light. I've already made friends. There's this boy, Sirius Black. He's in Gryffindor too, and I think we're going to be best mates. I'm hoping he'll want to come over to our place during the holidays. You guys would love him, I'm sure of it. He likes pranks just like us, Dad. Sorry, Mom. But despite the fun, James found his eyes constantly drifting toward the fourth boy in the dormitory, Remus. It bothered James in a way he couldn't quite put his fingers on, that Remus didn't seem to fit into their easy rhythm. The three of them were a riot. But Remus always stayed on the fringes, looking as though he wanted to join in but was afraid of getting too close. He'd disappear with his map and his wand, vanishing into the castle depths without a word to anyone. James had even tried to follow him once or twice, wondering if Remus was meeting up with some other secret group of friends, but the boy was always alone. It was a right puzzle. James kept trying to catch his eye, offering silent invitations to sit closer at dinner or join a game of cards, but Remus always kept those few feet of distance, his face unreadable. James desperately wanted to be his friend, but he was starting to worry that maybe Remus just didn't like them very much. He dipped his quill back into the inkwell, his brow furrowed as he finished the letter. I have 2 other dormmates too. Peter made it into Gryffindor, thank Merlin, so we're sharing a room now. It's like all the sleepovers we used to have back home, but even better, since we each have our own bed. Please tell Mrs. Pettigrew I'm taking good care of him. I won't let him get lonely. There's also Remus Lupin. He's a half-blood. Do you know his dad? It's his dad who's the wizard. I met him on the train, and he seems nice and cool. I'm trying my best to be his friend, but he goes off on his own a lot. I hope we haven't done anything to make him feel bad. What do you think I should do? James folded the parchment, feeling a strange weight in his chest. He was a Gryffindor now. Bravery was supposed to be his thing. He just had to figure out how to be brave enough to make a boy like Remus Lupin feel at home. Sunday, the 5th September 1971. By the time Sunday rolled around, James had decided that Remus Lupin was a bit like a ghost who occasionally decided to be solid. They had already grown used to this quiet boy performing his disappearing act. When they trudged back to the dormitory that evening and found his 4-poster empty, James didn't even blink. He was still riding the high of a day spent on the grounds with Sirius and Peter. They had spent hours at the Quidditch pitch, and James was already head over heels in love with it. The scale of the hoops, the smell of the grass, it felt like a kingdom he was destined to conquer. Once they were settled back in the room, Sirius made a beeline for that strange Muggle contraption of his. James watched with a mixture of fascination and skepticism as Sirius faffed about with the turntable. Sirius talked about the thing as if it were a holy grail, treating a record called Abbey Road like a priceless magical artifact. James tried his best to appreciate the noise coming out of it, but the lyrics were mental. He kept chiming in to ask what on earth a walrus or a silver hammer had to do with anything, much to Sirius's mounting irritation. Peter, who seemed just as baffled by the Muggle tunes as James was, reached for a different kind of entertainment. He began laying out his wizard chess set on the floorboards. Come on, James, let's have a match, Peter suggested. He was already nudging a knight into place, looking hopeful. James was about to hop down and join him. He was fairly certain he could multitask a game of chess while enduring Sirius's music, but Sirius snapped his head around, looking scandalized. He looked as if James had just suggested burning the Gryffindor banners of Worms. Oi, shut up and listen, will you? Sirius snapped. He was wearing an expression of such brooding seriousness that James almost felt like he was in trouble. James gave a callous shrug, generally not seeing why Sirius was being so touchy about a few Muggle singers. Sorry, mate, it's just doesn't sound that different from other music to me. Sirius gasped, his eyes widening with dramatic flair. You uncultured swine! He snatched a pillow off his bed and hurled in with surprising accuracy. James let out a bark of laughter, battling the cushion away with a flick of his wrist. The Beatles are gods among men, Sirius proclaimed, pointing a finger at the turntable. If Remus were here, he'd agree with me. The mention of Remus caused the room to go quiet. Peter, still hovering over his chessboard, looked up at the 4th bed. Where is Remus anyway? It's nearly curfew, Peter noted, his voice dropping into that anxious register. James looked at the empty bed, the red curtains tied back to reveal tucked sheets. A small frown tugged at his mouth. It was one thing to wander the castle during the day, but being out past curfew on a Sunday was a bold move, even for a Gryffindor. None of them had an answer, and for a moment the strange Muggle music was the only sound in the tower. James shook off the worry, turning back to the letter he'd been finishing for his parents. He scrawled the final lines with a flourish, his mind already drifting back to the Quidditch pitch. Try not to miss me too much while I'm away. I'm sure the house is dead boring without me around to stir things up. I miss you a lot too, though. I'll see you at Christmas. And I wouldn't mind finding a new pair of Quidditch gloves under the tree. Hint, hint. Jokes aside, I'm doing well, so don't worry too much. Love you, and see you soon. Your son, James. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked over, marking the end of curfew with a finality that made James jump. The fourth bed remained tidy, its spread hangings draped as if nobody had ever intended to sleep there. James couldn't stop himself from glancing between the oak door and the empty mattress, a cold knot of dread tightening in his chest. A part of him wondered if they'd somehow offended Remus so deeply he'd gone to beg the hat for a room change. Another darker part of his mind conjured images of the quiet boy lying at the bottom of a trick staircase or cornered by a nasty poltergeist. James felt a frantic itch to do something. He wasn't built for sitting around and fretting, but he had no idea if Remus would even appreciate being rescued. "Do you think we should ask someone?" Sirius asked, breaking the oppressive quiet. He was sprawled across his duvet, but James noticed his fingers were twitching at his sleeves, a clear sign the black composure was fraying. James let out a frustrated sigh, his hand flying to his hair to mess it up even further. "Maybe. I suppose it doesn't hurt to ask Frank, but I don't want to get Remus into trouble if he's just running late." The internal conflict was right pain. He wanted to be the reliable friend, but in his world a reliable friend didn't tattle to prefects. Sirius scolded at the door, looking equally torn. "Yeah, he does like to wander off, that one." In the end, the three of them surrounded to the exhaustion of their first week, though the sleep that followed was a total joke. James spent the night in a fitful state, half convinced every creak of the floorboards was Remus returning. Each time they squinted through the dark, the bed was still empty. He kept reciting his dad's words. "Hogwarts is the safest place on earth," over and over like a protective charm, but the serpent of unease in his stomach refused to stop coiling. Morning arrived with a bleak light, and the silence of the fourth bed was deafening. As they pulled on their school robes, James, Sirius, and Peter exchanged wordless looks. The consensus was clear. The mystery had gone too far. They had to tell Frank at breakfast. Just as James was reaching for his bag, the door to the dormitory was flung open with an echoing bang. Remus barked in, and James's heart nearly stopped. The boy looked like he'd been dragged through the forbidden forest and then trampled by a rough blotcher. He moved with an agonizing stiffness, as if every joint were rustled solid. His skin wasn't just pale, it was a sallow gray that made the dark violet circles under his eyes look like bruises. He looked more like a ghost than the boy who'd sat in the compartment. "Where were you?" James blurted out. He didn't mean for it to sound like an interrogation, but the words tumbled out of his mouth before he could stop them. His hand shot to the back of his head, trying to flatten the dark brown tufts, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a toddler. "Nowhere," Remus muttered. He didn't even look at them, heading straight for his trunk, and rummaging through it, with defensive movements. "Are you okay?" Sirius asked. Even he had stopped fussing with his own reflection in the mirror, his silver-blue eyes fixed on the bedraggled boy. "Yeah," James added, his worry bubbling over into a frantic sort of energy. "You look a bit off." Remus didn't take the concern well. He spun around, his face contoured into a scowl that looked painful. "Piss off," he muttered, his voice sharp and jagged. James winced. Brilliant work, James, he thought. Top-tier friend-making skills there. "We're just being nice," Peter interjected, standing with his hands on his hips, like he was about to deliver a lecture. The three of them stood in a silent line, staring in bafflement. Remus had started to pull his t-shirt over his head, but he stopped abruptly, his eyes flashing with a venomous glare. "What?" Remus snapped, the word hitting them like a stinging hex. "You're all gonna watch me get dressed? You posh boys are all a bunch of poofs." With an aggressive glare, he snatched up his clean robes and stormed into the bathroom. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the window panes. James let out a breath. his shoulders sagging. He felt a dab of frustration. He'd spent the whole night worrying himself sick, and all he'd got for his trouble was a door in the face and a slur. It was becoming painfully obvious that Remus Lupin didn't want a pack. He wanted a wall. But as James looked at the closed bathroom door, he couldn't get the image of Remus's haunted face out of his head. Whatever had happened last night, it hadn't been nowhere. "I'm hungry," Peter whinged, the sound of his stomach growling breaking the tense silence. "If we don't hurry up, we'll miss breakfast." Sirius looked at James, a heavy expression on his face. James just gave a helpless shrug. You couldn't force someone to let you in, no matter how much you wanted to help. "Go on then," James said quietly. Reluctantly, the three of them turned their backs on the bathroom door and headed down the spiral stairs, leaving Remus, as he demanded to be, alone.